the Start Your Own Business podcast.
Minister, thanks for joining us today.
Great to be with you.
I wanted to start with some really exciting news. The government have recently announced a brand new landmark £10 billion lending package to help small businesses here in the UK who want to expand their overseas business. I wondered if you could start by telling us something about the scheme, please.
So the purpose of the scheme and the idea behind the scheme is that the businesses who export pay more, they grow faster, they're more productive. And so it's about trying to make that exporting journey a little bit easier for SMEs, because it can be a sort of scary and daunting prospect to dip your toe into that. And so this is £10 billion working with all the major banks in the UK to make sure there's finance available for those exporting journeys. So if you need to invest in some way in your business to take advantage of those exporting journeys, you'll be able to do that thanks to this £10 billion of us standing behind the lending of those banks. And it's done through UK Export Finance. And I think a lot of the time that as an arm of government, people think about it as being something businesses use if they are sending frigates to Indonesia or something like that. Or building a bridge in Africa or something like that it's about de-risking those types of things. And we're really keen to make sure that SMEs understand that that's there for them, that the same kind of support that would go to, big manufacturers or engineering companies is there for small exporters as well.
Yeah. And we all know that lack of finance is a common barrier, particularly for small businesses, that prevents them from selling overseas. So can you tell us in a bit more detail about how UK Export Finance are supporting small businesses?
Yeah, so this announcement is about making sure that finance is there. And if your listeners are interested in exporting but are worried about some of the financial risks around it and are worried about whether the money will be there to support them, from the time of listening, that will be there and available so they can go to their bank right away today. But also alongside that, there's also advice available because it can feel like a pretty daunting leap when you're just trying to keep the lights on in your business to make those kind of long-term leaps. So there's advice from UK Export Finance, but we also have a network of hundreds of people we call export champions, who are business people who've been through this process. It includes lots of people in SMEs who can, it may not be exactly a direct match to your business, but they'll be able to tell their story in a way that you can picture your own business journey through it and give you some of that advice as to how to go about exporting. Because it makes such a huge difference, the profitability and productivity of a company to get into that exporting journey.
Yes, and I understand that there are other support schemes as well within that, including something called export insurance policies. What can you tell us about that?
So it's all about de-risking the passage of exporting. So making sure that when you do that, when you're investing in, capital or in staff or in whatever it is, to take advantage of those exporting opportunities, that we are removing the risk. So we're standing behind the banks in the same way that we do with the work we do with the British Business Bank, for example. We're supporting them lending to businesses. We're trying to make sure that that's the case here as well.
Yeah. And something else that I saw when I was having a look at the website is there are also things like export fairs where small businesses can be connected with possible suppliers in other countries as well. And that's a really helpful thing for small businesses that are first dipping their toes.
It is. And it's something that we sometimes think of as being, bigger companies will get on the plane with the Prime Minister and go on a trade mission and things like that.
Yeah.
But we're really keen that those types of opportunities of being put in the shop window is there for small businesses as well. We also have these Made in the UK, Sold to the World roadshows that we do around the country, which is about trying to link up SMEs in particular with buyers. So it's again just a sort of shop window to the world for what SMEs have to offer the world economy.
Yeah. And I think an important thing for our listeners to understand is that if they're taking out a loan, that if it's through the SME Export Fund, that the government will guarantee up to 80% of that loan?
That's right. And what that does is it makes it more affordable. It makes it possible because we have, all the, not just in export finance, but in SME lending across the board. We've had a real problem in this country for a long time now of banks not quite being willing to take the risk sometimes to lend to SMEs. And that's why it's so important for the government to stand behind it. And I think this £10 billion announcements that we're making, I think is the biggest sort of joint effort from the main banks in years. And I hope the fact that it's focused on SMEs shows that we are so conscious of how we can't grow the economy and get things done that we want to get done as a government without backing SMEs.
Yeah. I was looking around and I saw a report from the FSB, their Ready to Dispatch report, and that suggests that something like 35% of businesses that are not currently exporting, that are at the smaller end of the scale, would if they felt that they had the security of funding behind them.
If they have the security of funding, and I think also advice as well is so important. You've got to bring those two things together. But we don't export, particularly small businesses, we don't export in this country in the same way that other countries do. There is a maybe like risk aversion sometimes in this country when it comes to exporting. And that's why we're making such a big bet on this today, to try to create that culture change and encourage people to see this as an exciting opportunity rather than a sort of daunting risk.
Yeah, and it has the potential, I suppose, to unlock millions of pounds worth of investment and trade for the UK economy.
Absolutely, and I think alongside the financing, we're obviously working very hard to make sure in a pretty uncertain world, the access to markets is there as well. I mean, for example, I think the trade deal with India is an enormous opportunity for SMEs. And that's a really kind of under-exploited market for the UK, particularly given our cultural and historical links there. And so I think it's, again, just making sure that when we do these big trade deals, that it's not just something that's felt by big FTSE 100 companies, that it's felt right through the economy.
Yeah, and I suppose people sort of forget that actually small businesses make up a large part of our business in this country. Something like in excess of 90% of businesses are at the small end of the scale. So if we can free those businesses up to start exporting, that's got huge potential for the economy.
99.9, I think, % of businesses are SMEs. 2/3 of us work for SMEs. And the figure we're obsessed about that runs through our small business strategy is we could just grow those SMEs by 1% over the course of the next few years. It's worth about £320 billion to the economy. So, the potential is enormous.
Yeah. Starting to sell overseas can be hugely transformative for small businesses. Can you give our listeners an idea of how they might benefit?
Well, we know that businesses that export are about 25% more productive than those who don't. We know that they pay about 7% higher wages as well. I think there's also something maybe slightly less easy to quantify about that process of exporting being quite a good way of, it's almost sometimes a reset moment for a business where it's like returning to your original business plan, thinking forward, and it's almost a sort of renewal moment for businesses. The thing I found as well in the last few months doing this job and talking to businesses is that selling into international markets also becomes a source of pride, but also of credibility. That ability to say we sell to 5 countries, to 10 countries, to 20 countries, whatever it is, it's a mark of confidence, which in turn I think is helpful when you're thinking about what comes next and looking for finance or whatever your next step is for your business.
Yeah. I was also quite surprised to learn that actually businesses who are exporting are more likely to survive. They've got better survival rates than businesses that don't.
The more resilient, absolutely, yeah. And that makes sense, doesn't it, in a world where things are quite turbulent. And anyone who's run a business in Britain over the last 15 years or so has been through lots of
a bit
turbulence.
of a ringer.
Yeah, it's been an interesting times, shall we say. And I think it's a way of spreading risk as well, because you're expanding your customer base.
Yeah. I'd like to move on, if it's okay, to the government's plan backing your business, the plan for small businesses. The government wants to introduce a new £4 billion finance boost to increase access to finance for entrepreneurs and small businesses. What can you tell us about that?
So we know that since 2011 in this country, the amount of money lent by the traditional lenders to SMEs was falling by about 50% as a share of GDP. So there is a long-standing challenge there. And then you speak to any small business, they will talk about the big difficulty of getting access to finance as being something that holds them back. So we are increasing quite dramatically the money we put in through the British Business Bank. So similar to the conversation we're having about the export money that we're trying to make available, this is about us standing, it was two things actually. It's first of all standing behind through something called the Enable Guarantee, which tries to remove some of the risk for banks of lending to SMEs and so increases the number of loans that are available across all of the lenders to SMEs. But £1 billion of that is also going to about 69,000 startup loans for small businesses as well as part of that. Because often the most difficult time to get financing is when you're just starting out. And I think something really important alongside the money we put in for those startup loans that are delivered through high street banks is they're always attached to advice and mentoring support as well, so that people don't feel maybe quite so lonely when they're taking what can feel like a kind of risky step.
Yeah. When I had a look at the plan, there seemed to be kind of 5 main pillars, really. One of them was around tackling late payment to small businesses, access to finance, which you've talked about. Revitalising the high street was another key kind of area that was mentioned. Business skills, which is another thing that lots of small firms struggle with, particularly as things are moving so rapidly with AI, and obviously opening up opportunities for international trade, which we talked about in the earlier point. So there are some really quite ambitious plans there. One of those areas that's kind of important to help deliver that is the business growth service. What can you tell us about that?
So I ran a small business for 10 years and my goodness, going to try and find information from government could be depressing and a real kind of time suck. And often the information was there, but it was just difficult to find. And you found yourself with 10 different tabs open just to try to find an answer to a simple question. So what we're trying to do with the business growth service is really a step change in the advice that's available to businesses, where we're putting information about all the things you raised, access to finance, regulation, taxation, all of these things that are on people's minds in running a business into one place. So you don't have to go from pillar to post. So the ambition here is to have one relationship with government as business rather than having to leap between, you know, export advice or tax advice or regulatory advice or whatever it is. And I think if people who have maybe given up on business support in the past, re-engage and try at business.gov.uk, they'll see that it really has been a step change. So you go to the front page, you enter in some information about your business, you know, where you are, what type of sector you are, how big you are, and you'll start to get more tailored and personalised advice. And our aim is to keep making that better and better so it becomes more personalised and people get that help they need. Because we know that when companies do go for that advice, we know they grow faster because it's about, you know, giving people a shortcut to something that they might otherwise take a long time to arrive at.
Yeah. Going back to late payment, if you've run a small business yourself, you will know what a massive problem this is. And you know, I've been working in small business support for more than 20 years now, and I've heard time and time again successive governments saying that we're going to grasp the nettle, we're going to sort of crack this problem once and for all. And yet, you know, we're still here now. I can think myself of a major customer that we're working with that has not paid us, even though we had pre-agreed terms. The contract has been delivered. What's going to be different this time about how you finally tackle late payment?
Well, I'd say two things. The first thing is to say, I mean, you mentioned me running a small business. For me, this is deeply personal. I think back to one Christmas a few years ago where I was owed, I mean, tens of thousands of pounds. And so I know what it's like to think, how am I going to keep the lights on at home? How am I going to afford those Christmas presents? How am I going to pay my tax bill? You know, all those things when you're just waiting and waiting. And so there is the level of personal commitment there. The other thing I'll say is, I think the thing that's different, there have been There's been lots of good work done on this in terms of transparency in the past around payment practices and reporting on this. You have organisations like Good Business Pays doing really good work at trying to move cultural change. What we're talking about here is legal change. So we're consulting on what will be the really strongest package of any kind of major economy on late payments. So changing the length of time that people can wait to pay you, trying to deal with things like frivolous disputes, giving the Small Business Commissioner more powers to compel, looking at the interest which is available to people to be paid. And what we're trying to do there is change the power dynamic, because when you're a small business and one of your main customers, either in a very deliberate way, which is about improving their own cash flow, or just through indifference and a lack of understanding of how difficult it is for you as a small business person, isn't paying, it's really difficult for you to challenge them, because, you know, it's difficult to both seduce and challenge the same person. You know, you're trying to sell to them, you're trying to keep that relationship positive, but you've got a problem there. So we're trying to change it so that the default is towards faster payment, and that there are consequences to not doing that.
Yeah, and that's a really important thing, I think, for the government to do, because I understand something like 38 businesses fail every single day because somebody higher up the chain has decided or forgotten to pay the business, and that can be terminal when your cash flow is in the tens of thousands rather than the hundreds of thousands or millions of pounds.
So many businesses closing, but also, I mean, we've just been having a conversation about access to finance. So much cash flow tied up that could be hiring people, developing new products, or whatever it is. But then on top of that as well, I think I'm right in saying it's about 130 million hours of staff time tied up in the British economy, chasing invoices that again could be, you know, chasing new custom or looking for export opportunities or whatever it is. So I think if we can get this right, and I think we will, I think your listeners will be reassured with the strength of the proposals that we'll be coming forward with soon. I think it could be transformative to business growth in this country.
We look forward to the announcements.
And as I say, it's personal.
It's
deeply personal.
Something else I wanted to ask you about that I've got a bit of a personal interest in is business rates, particularly for pubs. My parents were publicans for 20 years. They've recently retired now, but they retired probably a bit earlier than they would have liked to, because, you know, business was getting more and more difficult. And the statistics from the valuation office, I think, for this year show that pubs and restaurants can expect something like a 30% increase in their business rates this year. We know that pubs are disappearing from our high street left, right and centre. I can think of, you know, a handful in walking distance from my house that have closed and are not opened anymore. The government has announced that it's got some plans in the bag to alter how business rates are calculated for pubs. What can you tell us about that? And indeed for retailers, you know, that are on the high street that are struggling to stay open.
Yeah, so I think the first thing to say is one of the strange things about being a business minister is you're not responsible for tax policy, which colleagues in the Treasury will set. But as you say, this is something they're looking at the moment. We had two things going on at once in the budget. The first was that we changed the multiplier to try to give permanently lower multiplier levels to retail and hospitality businesses. And that was paid for by increasing the multiplier that's paid by essentially big retail giant warehouses. And that was about trying to structurally rebalance things in favour of SMEs. I think the issue is that at the same time, we had the revaluation in the first one since COVID. Now, we put in about £4 billion to try to balance that out. But I think, as you've indicated, Treasury are very conscious that more needs to be done on that. And I think by the time this comes out, there will have been hopefully an announcement on that. Will give people a bit of certainty and reassurance on that.
Yeah. Another thing that we hear a complaint about quite often being in the small business advice is the amount of time that small businesses have to spend. You've already alluded to this when we're talking about late payment in terms of admin and compliance and running the business. What can the government do to help small businesses with that?
So it's one of those things, as well as being the Minister for Small Businesses, I'm also the Minister for Regulation across government. And I have a target hanging over me, which the government's committed to to reduce the administrative burden, the type of cost of red tape that you describe for business by 25%. That's about £6 billion we're trying to take off of business costs through that. We started on that journey as the business department. We're one of the biggest regulators of all the government departments. We started on that towards the end of last year, taking about £250 million of cost out of corporate reporting. So that particularly felt by SMEs because we were requiring fewer smaller companies to submit a strategic report, for example, and jump through hoops in corporate reporting that just didn't make sense for them. One of the things I have, and I find myself saying a lot in the work around reducing regulatory burdens, is to try to constantly think of regulation through the eyes of small businesses. Because often when we consult on how a new measure coming out of government will impact on business costs, often it's very big companies with large compliance departments who are the ones who respond.
Yeah.
And so sometimes we might be a bit guilty of thinking, well, actually, this is not going to have a major impact on business, when actually it will be most impactful on smaller companies who don't have that capacity and aren't able to adjust as easily. So that's one of the tests for me on regulation and on that work, is constantly having SMEs in mind. And I'd say to your listeners, we do have that sort of open call out to business to tell us those things which just seem insensible. The things with the forms you have to fill in that should be digitized and should be more simple, whatever the time-consuming regulatory burden is that you face, tell us. It's very easy to get used to these things and just to accept them. But we're very much in the market of trying to find ways to reduce those costs on small businesses in particular.
So have you got any particular ways that you're opening up for small businesses to contact you and give you that direct feedback?
Well, you mentioned, for example, the small business plan itself. I mean, we worked with more than 1,000 businesses to make sure the plan that we have, which is a cross-government plan, was based on the lived experience of businesses and the real challenges that they face every day. In addition to that, we have the Small Business Growth Forum that I meet with regularly, which has representatives not just of the bigger small business representative organisations, but also individual small businesses themselves. So I want this to feel like it's a continuing co-creation rather than something government is handing down from above.
Well, that kind of leads on quite nicely to raise a question that's actually come from one of our small business listeners. Chris Smith has asked us to ask you what the government's doing to enable small businesses to access government and public sector procurement opportunities.
So it's a really, really good question. And it's one, as well as, trade deals and access to finance and things like that, it's one of the big things that we can really make a difference on. So we have the new Procurement Act, which should open up far more opportunities to SMEs. This is something government has tried over and over again to do and found it very difficult to make an impact. But that act removes lots of the barriers that just made it impossible for smaller businesses to compete alongside larger providers, things like pre-requirements for insurance or surveys in advance of bidding and all these sorts of things. But we're not content with that. We're going further. So the Cabinet Office are consulting on how we can better improve the ability of small businesses to get into what sometimes can feel like a bit of a fixed system where the existing big suppliers dominate it and the system of application feels like it's set up for them rather than for the SMEs. And this is happening across government. So across government, we're looking at every department is setting a target for procurement with small businesses. We have had a meeting with my opposite number from the Ministry of Defence. So they are the biggest customer across the whole of government. And they're doing, I think, really exciting work to open up some of their contracts to innovative companies and smaller companies, in particular with a new centre focused particularly on that. But we've got to make it easier and simpler to do that because we're missing out on not just the economic opportunity for small businesses, but also, given that so many of these smaller providers will be innovative, we're missing out on advantages for customer service within the public sector, for the ability to do things more cheaply, more quickly, and more easily ourselves as well.
Yeah. And I think maybe there's some work to be done around the kind of perception that businesses have, in the same way with UK Export Finance, that it's only for, as you said, the giant companies that are sending these ships across the oceans. But actually, government have a commitment to give contracts to smaller firms, and that they are there and they are open to small firms to bid for too.
Yeah,
So,
but I think that culture change will only come if small businesses who, through these new opportunities, have a positive experience. Because I've spoken to small businesses who've said, look, I tried, even at a local government level or with a health board or health trust or whatever, found it a really bruising experience, found it to be, frankly, a waste of time. And I know that a lot of businesses will be reluctant to dip their toe back into that unless they have some certainty that things have changed. So I think there's a responsibility on us to really get this right.
Yeah. A kind of another area, I think, and you've covered this already partly, is that many small businesses don't know necessarily where to go when they need advice on various aspects to running their business and quite how that will work. So is there anything else that the government have planned to help kind of signpost small businesses to the relevant support for their business?
Yeah, so we spoke earlier on about the business growth service at business.gov.uk and that just being a much simpler way to signpost things. We are looking to bring more and more of what the government relationship with business into that, so that it does feel like that one place to do things. I think that although it needed improving, I think that advice and support at the very start of the business process was there. At the other end of the scale, if you're a really big company, it's quite easy to pick up the phone and unblock some issue that people have. There's a question that we're working on and talking about at the moment in the middle for people on that growth journey between those 2 points, and really trying to improve the service that we give to scale-ups and recognising that's just a slightly different need in terms of advice and support.
Yeah.
Now that can be, it could be issues around planning, it could be issues around something to do with regulation or getting the R&D support or whatever it is. But we're working quite hard on improving that offer, and we'll have more to say about that in the weeks ahead as well.
Fab. Small businesses are often described as the kind of backbone, really, of the UK economy. But the small businesses often feel, and we've covered this partly already, they feel like they're not heard by government. So what advice have you got for our listeners if they feel like they're banging their head against a brick wall and getting nowhere with something? How can they go about getting their voice heard?
Well, drop me a line. It's one thing because I'm always very keen to hear that. I think part of my one of the things I have in my head is we, as a minister, we talk so much in this country about business confidence. Sometimes when we talk about that, we are thinking about listed companies or really, really big private companies. And as you said earlier on, most companies, almost all companies in this country are small. I think we need to put more focus into thinking about how small businesses feel. Do they feel that they are ready to invest, to take that step into exporting, as we spoke about at the moment? And I think it's really important that businesses, the smaller businesses, see themselves in what government are doing as well, so that we are seen to be side by side with them, opening up trade opportunities, that when we have the conversation about regulation, that they can see their own experience in it. And you mentioned high streets earlier on as well, just a feeling that every bit of government has a responsibility towards small businesses. So I think for the first time now we're seeing, for example, the Home Office taking a really serious approach to high street crime, to whether that's shoplifting or whether that's bogus shops that are sort of squeezing legitimate retailers out of so many of our high streets. I think it's really important businesses look to government and thinks they get it, that we are responding to what people are experiencing in the economy.
Yeah. So finally, looking ahead to the next couple of years, if you're running a small business, that costs are still rising. We've got national insurance increase that businesses have had to absorb last year. We know already that the national minimum wage is going to be going up again from April, and the statutory rates for other various pays that you have to give your employee going up. Yeah. What would you say to small business owners that are kind of feeling like, I really don't know whether now's the right time to make that next step, to take the next employee, to open a new shop or take on new customers? What would you have to say to those businesses?
I would say don't wait. I completely get how difficult the last few years have been. I think the small businesses who have been through the financial crisis, the pandemic, Brexit, rising energy costs after the invasion of Ukraine, I understand why there's a feeling of waiting for the next crisis. That experience has created, in Britain, I think, a stock of really resilient, innovative companies, but sometimes companies who can feel a little bit risk averse because of that experience. I would say to them, look, we've spoken about increasing access to markets, whether that is the trade deals that we've done, the extra support that we're announcing for export finance. We're trying to make sure that the money is available, the capital is there through the billions of pounds we're putting into underwriting lending through the business bank. We are trying to make sure the advice is there, and we're trying to make sure that the customers are there as well. So I think wages are rising, which is a challenge for business, but it's also an opportunity because for the first time we're seeing wages rising faster than inflation, and so the customers are there. So I would say to businesses, if you're waiting for the right moment, this is it. So don't wait for that investment, that new product, that new location. And none of that is to minimise how much work I still have to do and the government still has to do to push down costs, to simplify things, to get rid of red tape. We're going to keep pushing really hard every day to make sure that we are making things more competitive, because we can go on in this country as a high-tax, low-growth economy. But this is, I think, the moment to look again, because, things are still tough, but things are changing.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. It's been great to talk to you today. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for your time, Fiona.
Cheers.